giving a brief overview today, and we'll go through some disclaimers as we progress. So I always like to start off with presentations, kind of introducing what a school psych is, because I feel like even in the field of school psych, it is so niche. And even like where you practice is really dependent too on what your skill set looks like. So I am trained in diagnosing developmental disorders, along with those special education eligibility decisions. So that's kind of my current role in North Kansas City right now, though I have experience in all of these roles. But also I specialize in general education supports for students and teachers. So you might only hear of a school psych kind of in that special education domain, but really I work at that tier 1 level, which we'll talk a little bit about MTSS later in the presentation, at that tier 1 level, supporting all students. And then behavior, social, emotional, and academic interventions is another area of expertise, as well as counseling. So like I said, my primary role in the schools is that special education eligibility decision-making, as well as supporting that tier 1 intervention and implementation for those behavior, social, emotional, and academic interventions. You'll find that school psychs in medical settings have far different expectations and far different jobs, from diagnosing disabilities to really doing like PCIT, if you're familiar with a lot of those autism interventions and things like that. So my primary area is really those general ed supports and special education eligibility. So that's kind of what I'll focus on today. So the objectives of the presentation. So caregivers will learn the purpose of IDEA and the differences between medical and educational diagnoses. I feel like that's kind of a nuance when I come in contact with caregivers that they're not really familiar with. So I really want to emphasize that, including how these distinctions may affect the child's access to services and support. Caregivers will become more familiar with their parental rights under IDEA. This is not a thorough presentation on your rights as a parent. That would take days. So I provided a lot of resources, hopefully, to provided by the Kansas Department of Education that outlines your rights as well. And then the third point is to gain an understanding kind of generally of what a multi-tiered systems of support looks like, and how you could use that to advocate for any child under your care at that time. So a disclaimer, this will be a general overview. It's nearly impossible, I think, to go through all the nuances of IDEA, let alone within an hour. And this is also not intended to supplement any legal advice that you would get for your specific situation. So if you have any legal advice that you need, please consult an attorney. I'm not qualified to make those guidances there. And then there's always a disclaimer that the information provided is what's outlined by Kansas, by the State Department in Kansas, not in is the general overview that what may apply for your district, but each processes within each different district look very different. So there's certain standards that they have to meet that we'll go through specifically, but MTSS, who's in charge of kind of special education eligibility, differs depending on the state or depending on the district. And then the protections discussed in this presentation are only to those students receiving public education unless requested for private purposes, at least currently. So please reach out to your specific district on how these processes differ. I also wanted to give a shout out to one of the partners for the organization. So Families Together provides that free, really intensive training on IDEA and how that looks for foster care families. So their upcoming training is August 27th from 9 to 3. As you can see, they have a far greater time frame to kind of go in depth. So that really is a training that's more intended to supplement a general overview, like what's provided in this. So they're the experts. Definitely reach out to them if you have any specific questions. And I believe this event is free as well. So there's information and they should have it on their website too. So prevalence rates. During the 2022 to 2023 school year, over 7.5 million students, about 15% of students nationwide, aged 3 through 21, receive special education supports under IDEA. So that is the most up-to-date statistic provided by the National Center for Education Statistics. Within Kansas, about serves about 15% of their population with IDEA funds. Nationally, 13% of the students who are served under IDEA receive those services under the autism category. However, the most common disability category is a specific learning disability. Approximately 32% of those 15% of students receiving special education supports do so under a specific learning disability category. Sources also estimate that about 30 to 50% of students in foster care receive special education services. Unfortunately, the National Center for Education Statistics doesn't outline students in foster care services, so there wasn't a comparable statistic for that. And then the the Families Together Incorporation noted that more than 900 students in Kansas are youth with disabilities whose parents are unknown, unavailable, or whose parental rights have been terminated. So that's all in context as well. Take the water really quick. So here are some key terms and definitions that I'll kind of be using interchangeably throughout the presentation. So IDEA stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Act. FAPE stands for Free and Appropriate Education. An IEP is an Individualized Education Plan. An IFSP is an Individualized Family Service Plan. And a 504 plan colloquially is protections guaranteed under a Section 504 plan. So always, hopefully, define that acronym first before using the acronym in context. Felt like those were important as well. Okay, so here's a general overview of IDEA. So IDEA is a law that requires schools to provide children with disabilities a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, in the least restrictive setting or least restrictive environment, or LRE. So I'm sure if you've ever been in a school and worked with students with disabilities, you'll hear IDEA, FAPE, LRE referenced a lot. So I feel like those are important to know what they stand for. So IDEA funding sources are fulfilled under Part B for students ages 3 through 21 and Part C for children aged birth through age 3. It's always confusing to me that the younger students are served under Part C, but they did not consult me when making this, so I get that. Part B and C regulations under IDEA require states to have comprehensive child find systems, is how they operationalize that for the purposes of identifying, locating, and evaluating students and children with disabilities. However, these systems are not operationalized in the law for how they must look. So variations amongst districts vary greatly. In my district and in districts that I've worked in Florida as well, kind of have a day a month that they come and screen kids under child find for disabilities, but that can really look different depending on your district and what district that you're assigned to. Part B explicitly states that these laws extend to all children, including those living on an Indian reservation, those who are migrant or homeless, wards of the state, or attending a private school. So I thought that quote was essential for this presentation here. Frequently, special education services are fulfilled through an individualized education program, or an IEP. We're all really familiar with that acronym. Under one of 13 disability categories as defined federally by IDEA. Kansas is a little bit different. It has 14 eligibility categories because it includes giftedness. Kansas is kind of unique in the fact that it uses the term exceptionality rather than disability, which the majority of other states use. So that includes giftedness. So you'll hear 13 disability categories because that's what's recognized by IDEA, but in Kansas, there are 14 exceptionality categories, if that makes sense. And then students with disabilities can also receive services under a Section 504 plan, but these are not under the same funding sources as IDEA and IEP services. So those are very separate entities, even though they still are rights for students with disabilities in schools. Part C, so this is a little bit about those services for students aged birth to 3. So Part C is that funding source that applies to those early intervention services. Each state and school district has their own processes for determining eligibility, which is really important to note here. So this presentation, again, is aimed to give a general overview how the state of Kansas has operationalized the rights of students and parents under IDEA. So and it really differs. So I lost my place in my notes. So there are a lot of differentiation between districts who's in charge of determining eligibility. In my district, it is a school psychologist. I know in a lot of other different districts it is. But there are also process coordinators and administration and special education coordinators who kind of lead these processes in different areas. So it could vary drastically depending on your district who your contact person would be. Generally, people who are good to look out for to ask these questions and would be their special education coordinator, school psychologist, administration, or a local agency that could have these answers. But I think that was important to know. So Part C and Part B under IDEA are governed by two different entities. So Part C is governed by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, and then Part B is governed by the Kansas State Department of Education. So that differentiation of funding sources is vital in how we determine eligibility. So Kansas regulations require local districts to implement age-appropriate screening procedures for children birth through age 5. These screenings are required within 30 days of parent, caregiver, or any provider request. As I kind of mentioned earlier, this type of screening and the way that the screening is done differs greatly by the district and where you live. However, it's important to note that you cannot pick and choose which areas that children are assessed in. So for under Part C, the child is required to be examined in all areas of development. So not just the area of suspected delay. So this includes cognitive, physical, motor, communication, social, emotional, adaptive, self-help domains in each of these screenings. So you can't just say, oh, they're having problems in motor, I'm concerned with their motor development. These general screenings at the schools are required to examine all of these domains. It's a fairly quick assessment typically. In the assessments that I've used in the past, it's about an hour, and it's more of an inventory, working one-on-one with either an assessor or sometimes we use parents to teachers, so that's a program that they can use too. But it's about an hour-long screening procedure typically. And then prior to the screening, referrals are typically done by physicians, hospitals, childcare programs, public health facilities, homeless and foster care programs, and they are required if they suspect a delay to relay this information within 2 days of identifying a need to the local district. So like I mentioned earlier, Part C eligibility is not based on one of the 13 IDEA eligibility categories, which is a little bit different, but on developmental delay or established risk. So a developmental delay, a child under 3 must show delays in one or more of the developmental domains. So these are cognitive, physical and motor, communication, social, emotional, and adaptive or self-help domains. Exact percentage thresholds are determined by other policies. Typically, it's about greater than or equal to a 25% delay. Some districts calculate this delay by comparing the child's developmental age as measured by that assessment that they took to their chronological age. So once that screening is done, the report that is given to you should always contain that information, but also be interpreted for you. So you should not be guessing whether or not the child meets that criteria. And then an established condition is another eligibility criteria under Part C. So a diagnosed physical or mental condition with a likelihood of a developmental delay is another area to qualify under Part C as well, for a child at risk for a developmental delay. So this is children under 3 with substantiated abuse, neglect, prenatal substance exposure that must be referred, though they are not automatically eligible. I know there's a lot of words on this slide. Typically, I don't prefer to do presentations like with this many words on the slide, but since we are talking about the law, a lot of things are paraphrased, but are directly quotable for that. So I thought that was important if anyone's taking notes or something like that to include here. So assuming that the child is referred, goes through the screening process, and is determined that they need to proceed for a formal evaluation under Part C, a comprehensive assessment is then initiated. Sometimes they use the results of the screenings in these comprehensive assessments. So it's not just a screening and then kind of a throwaway situation, for lack of a better word. But in addition to that screening, other standardized assessments are used here. So these can look like standardized and non-standardized assessments. Sometimes our kiddos, especially that young, cannot participate in standardized assessments like you would typically see. So that's kind of why that non-standard option is there. An observation is required. They look at previous assessments and medical conditions, especially if they are given that referral, parent interviews and developmental history, medical records, and then again, all 5 developmental domains must be assessed, even if one domain, only one area is suspected to have a delay. And then the evaluation and assessment must be conducted within 45 calendar days of the referral. So that's also a right within this. And then if eligible under Part C, instead of an IEP for Part C, an individualized family service plan is required to be provided to fulfill the child and family needs in the natural environment. So it's a lot different than what Part B looks like, which we'll talk about later, and which are your IEPs and other types of services. Each family is also assigned a family service coordinator who is required to find providers to service the IFSP through programs such as 10K that are overseen by the KDH. Just pausing really quick to double check there's not any questions on this. And then sometimes we find that students who are served with this IFSP do request or require additional special education support. So there's actually a whole guidance document on what that looks like transitioning from an IFSP to an IEP or a possible IEP. I'm not going to go through every inch of this, but I just thought it's important to note and have in your copy, hopefully that went out, of what this process looks like. So there is a process, it's not guaranteed, and it has to happen within 90 days prior to their 3rd birthday. I'll leave that on the screen. When I screenshot that, okay, Part B. All public school students are entitled to FAPE, and exceptional children attending private schools are entitled to FAPE through an IEP request. So that's kind of important to note too, that while this does apply generally to public school, it also is available to students in private schools depending on the situation upon request. So we just went through the transition from Part B to Part C briefly. So Part B, again, is servicing those students aged 3 through 21. So initial referrals and evaluations for special education services for those age students are overseen by Part B. So there's a key difference between Part B and Part C in that Part B, to be eligible under Part B for an IEP, a child must meet the criteria of one of 13, 14 in Kansas, exceptionality categories, and they have to demonstrate that adverse educational impact that requires individual instruction. So those Part C services are intended to service that family, and Part B is where we get in a little bit in the mud, in that it has to demonstrate that adverse educational impact for students, which is where a school psychologist might come in. So why a child might have that medical diagnosis, such as autism level 1, for example, if they're not demonstrating an educational impact that requires individualized instruction as determined by the school team, by you as parents, then the more restrictive placement or special education services may not be required. So the student may not qualify for an IEP if that second prong approach is not met. So it's a little bit different, but this is probably something that you're more familiar with. I thought that it's important to note here how Kansas describes an educational decision maker, as described by the Kansas Department of Education. So they are typically a biological or adoptive parent, or another person designated as an educational decision maker as designated by that biological parent. It also outlines, this is their verbiage, not mine, a foster parent cannot act as an educational decision maker unless the biological parent's rights have been legally suspended or terminated, or the court has explicitly appointed the foster parent and or other individual as an educational decision maker or an educational advocate. So always ask your local agencies, an attorney or something like that, if you have any questions on who is the educational decision maker for a child under your care. Okay, so this is a general overview of Part B eligibility. This was from the Kansas Special Education Process Handbook, which I think I included as an attachment as well, that you can always reference at any time. But this is what an initial evaluation generally looks like. So an initial request. So the child is generally in a general education setting if they're not receiving those special education services. And then the parental involvement, I'm hoping you can see my cursor here. But the parental involvement is this part here. So that could typically allude to notification of concern or a notification of intervention. The Kansas Department of Special Education and the Kansas State Department, excuse me, reference parent rights throughout this whole thing. So I'm going to use educational decision maker and parent interchangeably because the Kansas Special Education Process Handbook explicitly notes parental rights, not educational decision maker rights. So I'll use those kind of synonymously. And then it also notes that after this first request of concern, a general education intervention must be attempted prior to an initial referral for special education evaluation. And we'll discuss what that looks like in the next slide. And then after that general education intervention has been tried, they'll then make a request or a referral for an evaluation. So either a parent or a school makes that initial request for a formalized evaluation. And then at that point, the educational decision maker, or as Kansas notes, the parent is given a copy of their procedural safeguards, which is frequently referred to as parental rights. So I think I provided a copy of that parental safeguard as well and procedural safeguards. So we'll kind of go through some big points of those as well. And then if it is deemed that a disability is suspected, the child is then referred to for a formalized evaluation. And then the first step of that is a review of existing data meeting where process begins if there is a suspected disability. And then they'll go through the eligibility determination and meeting. And then if the child continues to be eligible or meets that initial threshold for eligibility, you'll have an IEP team meeting. And then there be the special education services and so on and so forth. So this is that general overview of what the process should look like. Okay, general education interventions. So the most popular general education intervention framework is called MTSS, or Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. The Kansas Department of Education notes MTSS as a possible option, but does not require states or districts, to use MTSS specifically. So this is the most popular kind of service delivery model for interventions in general education supports. So I felt like this would be helpful to include. So this is a way that schools organize and districts organize their general education interventions. So an MTSS framework is where people screen all kids' skills to determine what students need extra help and then what supports they need based on their need. So this can be for academics, social skills, and or behavioral skills. Students may move and change between the tiers depending on their response to interventions and the need for the family that's deemed appropriate. So generally, MTSS is organized into 3 tiers. So tier 1 is those general education supports that all students get. So this is your general instruction. And then if there is a need, or if your child is behind in reading, for example, or they're not learning their letters appropriately or keeping pace with other students their same age, they may receive that more individualized attention in a small group intervention. So that's kind of that tier 2 level. tier 3 are labeled those intensive individualized interventions. So sometimes, like at my school, for example, kids are pulled out for about 30 minutes a day and receive that one-on-one instruction with a reading interventionist. So that would be that tier 3 intervention. And all of this happens in that general education environment. So really, if you're concerned about one of your students under your care or something like that, these are supports that you can advocate to be used for all different types, not academics, but also behavior, social emotional concerns within that general education environment, right? So not through the IEP system or IDEA protections or anything like that at all. This is a little in the weeds here, but some disability categories in some districts may require general education interventions prior to referral for special education. So sometimes there will be districts that require RTIs, another word for academic MTSS, to identify a specific learning disability, as well as other disability categories are possible for other health impairments or emotional behavioral disorders. Um, so kind of one of the takeaways that I have here is that you could always request additional tiers of support or additional interventions for students, even in the general education environment. If you don't know who the educational decision maker is or something like that, these are not typically supports that require explicit consent. Counseling and things like that are a little bit different, but especially those academic supports can happen within that general education environment. And Kansas explicitly states that these must be tried if you're suspecting that the child might need special education services. Okay, so this is kind of where I spend most of my time in the referral phase. So there's a popular misconception that only schools can request initial evaluations for special education supports, which is wrong. So either a parent can request written or verbal. It does not have to be written. A verbal request is sufficient, but obviously written is less disputable at any time throughout the school year and also at multiple times in a school year. So if they're saying at the district level, you made that request last month, let's try again, in 6 months. You don't have to wait that 6 months. You can request at any time for your child or student under your care if you're the educational decision maker to be evaluated for sports. So each district has its own processes for how they handle special education requests for evaluation. They can reject that evaluation, right? If you're requesting evaluation and they don't see a need, even if the child does have a medical diagnosis of a disability, they do not have to accept your request. They do have to make that request in Kansas, at least within the first 15 days of the request. If you do disagree, then you could file a due process complaint with the state, which has a different kind of process entirely. You, however, are required to receive a prior written notice citing why the school does not believe the child does not need special instruction or special education support. Typically, they're required to include sources of their data. So either screening or discipline referrals or teacher concerns, social concerns, academic or behavior data that explains the reasoning for making this decision. It's also important to note here that some parents are misconstrued, like, oh, because my child is not achieving at the rate that they should be for reading, they automatically need special education support. It's important to know that if they're using some sort of intervention model, if the student is making better than expected progress, which is operationalized a little bit differently depending on the district, then they might not be eligible for those special education supports because they're not demonstrating that they cannot make progress in that least restrictive environment. And then again, if you disagree with this, you can always file a due process complaint. I would really emphasize trying to talk to the person that made this determination. For me, it's school psych. So I typically always call parents and kind of explain the reasoning for why I'm not accepting the evaluation request at that time. I kind of gauge their comfortability, and try to see if there's any other support that they think they might be needing, and kind of explain how the evaluation and eligibility process works in schools. However, school and parent-initiated evaluations can proceed if they do suspect that a child has a disability and is not making adequate progress in general education settings despite those general education interventions. So that's kind of when once that notification is made and that is determined the child needs an evaluation and that you suspect the child has a disability and needs those additional special education supports, then they would then ask for consent for a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation. So you, as an educational decision maker, you always have the right to withhold consent for evaluation or services or withdraw your consent at any time. So once that consent is signed, you can always withdraw that request at any time. Once that evaluation is requested, guardians are provided with their procedural safeguards, which outlines their parental rights during the evaluation and eligibility process. The Kansas Department of Education has a really great parental guide that helps explain the rights in depth as well as the process in depth as well a little bit better. I have a slide coming up that kind of provides that general overview because it is a really large document. They said in our limited time doesn't let me go through all of that. So school psychologist, sometimes process coordinator, sometimes special education support person. It's confusing for us within the field as well. We'll provide that prior written notice documenting whether the school suspects the child needs that individualized instruction or not. This is kind of sometimes where, as a professional, I might suggest a Section 504 plan. So I'll go through what the difference is between an IEP, special education supports, and a Section 504 plan. We'll click on this slide. So this is a little handout that I use a lot with parents. So an individualized education program or an IEP provides individualized special education and related services to students with a disability under IDEA. However, Section 504 plan is a formal plan that provides supports and accommodations, but does not include goals and objectives. So Section 504 plan has a broader definition of a disability rather than IDEA. So it doesn't require that individualized instruction. So sometimes I'll suggest, hey, let's try a Section 504 plan, some accommodations first, because I don't quite see the threshold of meeting that individualized instruction threshold. So you'll see that IDEA is a federal special education law. A Section 504 plan is a federal civil rights law for protections for students with disabilities and other sorts of civil laws. So an IEP, a child must meet criteria of one or more of 13 disability categories and demonstrates that adverse educational impact, but also requires that specialized instruction to make progress in schools. A Section 504 plan has a broader definition of a disability. A student must have a disability that impacts one or more major life activities. This can include learning, reading, communicating, and thinking. The disability must interfere with the child's ability to learn in a general education classroom. The rules for who creates a Section 504 plan are far less specific than for IEPs. The evaluation team generally includes the student's caregivers, their classroom teacher, the school counselor, and school principal. Compared to with an IEP, there are designated members who are required to be there, such as a school psychologist, an LEA, parents, teachers, special education teachers. IDEA outlines specific people who are required to attend eligibility meetings and IEP meetings. And then an IEP plan, again, is that specially designed instruction. It outlines who provides the services, how many minutes per week, and where, any accommodations and modifications. So typically this is helpful when a child transitions from having a Section 504 plan to an IEP plan. Assistive technology, how the student will be included in that general education setting or the least restrictive environment, annual goals, and those annual meetings to use to track the student's progress. And then really that Section 504 plan, again, are just those accommodations that have rights rights for students with disabilities, but are not limited to preferential seating, chunking assignments, extended time, etc. They can also have assistive technology tools or other things like that. But these are really accommodations, not that individualized instruction. Right? So this is the first step of an evaluation process. So if deemed necessary for evaluation, so as a school initiated the evaluation, they're suspecting that a student has a disability and needs individualized instruction as a guardian. They have consented to the evaluation through that prior written notice. And then simultaneously, what's called a review of existing data process may be scheduled. This can be completed via phone. We prefer, in my practice, to actually have a review of existing data meeting while we're explaining to the parent why we suspect that this child has a disability that warrants special education services or not. And then getting that parental input, the medical input, previous medical evaluations, and things like that. So really getting all on the same page of what data is out there supporting the student and making sure that all areas of suspected disability are assessed during this evaluation plan. And then that prior written notice is provided. The prior written notice outlines what evaluation or assessments that the examiner intends to use. So in the different areas of assessment that they're planning to assess. And this has, the school has 60 days to conduct the evaluation, provide an eligibility determination, and develop an IEP within that timeline. So Kansas also allows for timelines to be extended if the child transfers to another district. So this follows them across districts mid-process, and both the district and parent agree to a new timeline. So the parent must sign a written extension of the timeline to extend past that 60 school days that Kansas outlines. And then that 60-day timeline does not start until the consent is received by the school. So the evaluation may look very different depending on what disability category that the school is suspecting they would be eligible for. My evaluations for specific learning disabilities look far different from those for students who have autism or an emotional behavioral disturbance. So majority speaking, they all include a rating scale. So those are those pages that you'll get from the doctor sometimes that have symptoms that you either endorse or say how frequently they happen, that you see them, etc. So we always try to use rating scales from at home and at school to kind of compare what their behavior looks like. I always conduct an academic assessment for a student to see for that educational impact, right? To assess that. So that's something that the clinic sometimes doesn't do as well, especially for students with developmental disabilities or disorders. They don't really look at that academic impact. And then lots of observations for sure. So hopefully the evaluation is done comprehensively, but those are some frequent things that you'll see. And then once that evaluation is complete, an eligibility meeting will be scheduled by the school, and it will include members that should be listed on that prior written notice. Generally speaking, they are to include an individual to interpret results, typically a school psychologist. Sometimes it's a speech and language pathologist. Sometimes it's a process coordinator, depending on, what district you're in, of course. An LEA, so that's that local agency representative or local education agency. Typically that's a principal, a special education director. A general education teacher is required, as well as a special education teacher and any related service providers. So if you're seeking to have services in occupational therapy, an OT should be there, or a speech language pathologist, etc. And then, at the eligibility meeting, all of the results should be reviewed and explained to you as a parent, as well as the copy that you will get of the report explaining these things. So that's really to help you understand and ask questions on what is going on and what the results of the evaluation found. Sometimes they'll combine this if the student is deemed eligible at the eligibility determination with an individualized education plan or an IEP meeting, given that the parent provides that initial consent for services at the eligibility meeting to provide those services where they found that the child needs that individualized instruction. And then once the parent or guardian provides written consent for services, an IEP will be developed with members of the team. So an IEP services are mandated to begin within 10 school days of that finalized IEP that is given to you as parent or as educational decision makers. Again, an evaluation report is required to be delivered to parents. Kansas is a little obscure with this. It notes that within a reasonable time after eligibility determination. So I'd ask your district, when should I expect this report? Where should I be looking for it? Will it be in a backpack? Will it be emailed to me? Depending on what system that they use. So if a student is found ineligible for services, and we'll go through an example of what an eligibility determination might look like. And specifically, I think I included an autism example. We'll go through the eligibility indicators handbook that Kansas outlines as well here. So if a student is found not eligible for services at this eligibility meeting, a Section 504 plan may be considered here as well. We kind of looked at the differences between an IEP and a 504 plan. Okay. So I know that many of you are probably not medical professionals, so this will be a very brief overview, but I think it's helpful to kind of walk a day in the shoes, not in my shoes, but in determining eligibility. So this is an example case that I obviously made up. So this is a parent request. So a parent is asking me to complete a special education evaluation for their student. The student is about 7 years old in second grade. They do have an existing autism level 1 diagnosis. Academically, their grades are about B's and C's. All of their academic screening measures are above the lowest 25th percentile for a nationally ranked measure. Typically in my district and in nationally speaking, if your child is not below that 25th percentile, they're kind of in that average range for academic performance, which is a little bit different than what medical providers look at for learning disabilities and things like that. So if you're not in that lowest quartile of academic supports, then it's not indicated that you would always necessarily need individualized instruction in that academic area. And then some general education supports that they receive. They receive some weekly emotional regulation counseling. They have data monitored with that. So either the school or the behavior specialist is taking daily data on how this person's dysregulations are occurring in school. So data supports that the instances of dysregulation are trending downward in the past 3 months. Some other concerns. So the teachers have some concerns with the student navigating peer social situations and relationships. They also have some of those accommodations with preferential seating and prompting before unstructured times. His peer conflict has decreased as well. So what do we have here? Here's the exclusionary criteria that is defined in that eligibility indicators. So these are things that all school psychologists and all people making eligibility decisions have to examine before they can determine whether a student is eligible or not. So the first exclusionary criteria notes that a lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math is not causing the academic deficit that we're seeing with the student. They must not have a limited English proficiency that is impacting primarily their achievement. They also must not exhibit evidence that shows the child's learning difficulties are not due to factors other than those associated with the criteria for disabilities as defined in IDEA. For example, their academic difficulties may not be due to frequent moves, incarceration, substance abuse, or chronic absenteeism, etc. Thought this was kind of important to note for a lot of our students who are highly mobile or don't have stable family and housing situations. So that might be an exclusionary criteria that qualifies them, unfortunately, for being eligible for services under an IEP. And then the term shall not apply if the student's educational performance is adversely affected primarily because the student has an emotional disability. So the criteria for an emotional disability is very different, and a different presentation that kind of extends beyond most of my days, but also may not be due to an explicit emotional disability. So since the student did have a medical diagnosis of autism, here is how the eligibility indicators defines autism. So autism means having a developmental disability significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication, social interaction, generally evident before age 3, but not necessarily so, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Other characteristics often associated with autism are engagement in repetitive activities and stereotype movements, resistance to environmental change or daily routines, and unusual responses to sensory experiences. The term shall not apply if a child's educational performance is adversely affected, primarily because the child has an emotional disturbance. Again, that exclusionary factor. So I'm gonna stop sharing for a second because I actually pulled up the indicators handbook. I can figure it out, sorry. Hold on 1 second. Okay. So here is, if you've never seen it, probably not. This is something I like to do through all of my eligibility determination meetings, show where I'm getting this information. It is explicitly outlined. So I always think it's helpful to show here since we're talking about autism. Here is what we just read together, the inclusionary criteria for autism. Here are the exclusionary factors that I generally outlined here. Um, and then Kansas is nice in that it actually operationalizes some examples for how this exclusionary factor may be assessed. And then lack of appropriate instruction, they separate out math and reading differently here. So these are 2 prongs as well, limited English proficiency. And then, that was not, okay. So then here are the specific questions and things that the team, the eligibility decision team asks itself. So for meeting that first prong, does the child exhibit an exceptionality? Typically with that medical diagnosis, it is fairly evident, but also in schools, children, even without medical diagnoses, through the evaluation process, through the measures, the interviews, the observations, then you would assess these different domains. So even though a child might have a medical diagnosis, all of these adverse impacts and diagnostic criteria must be evident in the report. So the first example is an evidence of a developmental disability that significantly affects verbal communication. So that's the first prong. And there are the other prongs as well. And then prong 2 is really that adverse educational impact. So identifying a need for specialized instruction here. So this is really the prong that a lot of people get stuck with. So these are different indicators that show how a child may meet the second prong here. Great. That was probably a little bit there. But I just wanted to show that eligibility indicators handbook. I just looked at the time, so I'll kind of hurry up here. That eligibility indicators that would be helpful to look at. So in this example case, since the child is receiving that emotional regulation counseling and their past 3 months of data has indicated that they're making progress in that general education and intervention, I may not recommend eligibility at that time because it's not showing an adverse educational impact. So they have fairly adequate grades. Their screening measures are above the 25th percentile, and they're showing an increase in their target social behaviors and emotional regulation behaviors through those general education support. So obviously this is not all of the details of the case, but that might be some reasoning that a special education evaluation is not deemed eligible at that meeting. If the child would be deemed eligible, here are some parental rights that are guaranteed under IDEA. So you are provided those services listed in the IEP at no cost to you or your child. The services must meet the Kansas State Board of Education standards for children with and without disabilities. They must follow IEP requirements anywhere in Kansas as well. And then here's kind of an overview of the procedural safeguards as well. I made a little table that notes kind of your different rights. You have a right to prior written notice, right to consent before initial evaluation, reevaluation, initial services. You always have access to records. You always have the right to participate in meetings. And then you have a right to an independent educational evaluation if you disagree with the evaluation that was provided to you, dispute resolution, and these other rights as well. So I highly recommend that you look at that procedural safeguard document provided by Kansas. Sorry for rushing through these. These will always be there for your reference. I just realized the time. And then again, a little bit about reevaluations and IEPs. So IEPs are required to be reviewed annually. You can have an IEP meeting at any time with a parent or school team request. Any changes to an IEP at all, a prior written notice is always required to notify you as an educational decision maker before any changes are made. These can be a little in the weeds here, but they can be completed with an amendment, so it doesn't have to be a full meeting, but you're always required to have notice. Reevaluations for students in special education services are required to happen every 3 years or at any point upon request, can be completed with a review of existing data meeting. And then this is just kind of a note about least restrictive environment. Placement decisions are only determined in Kansas after the IEP is developed. So placement is never determined by the category, rather the need of the student. So a lot of times parents will request that a child be placed in a more restrictive setting, and that really is more of a IEP and a meeting rather than just, oh, this child needs to be moved to a different disability category to receive this placement. So it's kind of one of those misconceptions I thought was important to address here. And then here are just some references for this presentation. So yeah.